In the 20th century, there are a few names that are just synonymous with radical, brutal ideology, and Pol Pot is right at the top of that list. As the leader of the Khmer Rouge, his vision for Cambodia didn't just reshape a nation, it completely shattered it, leading to the systematic death of millions. So we're going to dig into how this nightmare even happened.
Okay, picture this. It's April 17th, 1975. After years of a really brutal civil war, the capital city, Phnom Penh, suddenly goes quiet. Soldiers in black uniforms just enter the streets. For a lot of people, this moment probably felt like relief, like the war was finally over. But it was actually the beginning of something so much worse. So you have to ask, right? How did a nation's liberation become a nationwide prison camp? To really get that, we need to understand the man who was pulling all the strings. You know, he wasn't always the infamous Pol Pot. He was born Saloth Sar, and his journey from being a pretty promising student to the architect of a genocide, well, it's a chilling story of how radical ideas can take root. So get this, Saloth Sar's path to extremism wasn't born out of some personal struggle or oppression. He came from a pretty well-off family, and he even won a scholarship to go study in Paris. But you have to remember, post-war Paris was this hotbed of radical thought, a hub for anti-colonial movements and intense Marxist debate. And it was right there, in that environment, that he soaked up the ideology that would completely change him. The man who came back to Cambodia was not the same one who left. And that right there, that's the turning point. The technical student was basically gone, and in his place was a revolutionary. His goal wasn't personal success anymore. It was the total radical transformation of his entire country. Now look, an ideology alone doesn't just take over a country. It needs an opportunity. And in the 1970s, Cambodia was just engulfed in chaos, which created the perfect storm for a radical movement like his to rise up. It really was a perfect storm. Cambodia was being torn apart by its own civil war, there was widespread political repression, and, of course, the chaos of the Vietnam War was spilling right over its borders. So in this total power vacuum, the Khmer Rouge came in and offered this desperate displaced population a very simple, very powerful promise. We'll bring order and we'll end all the corruption. And on that day in April, those soldiers in black entered the capital, but they weren't liberators. They were the enforcers of a new, terrifying reality. The fighting stopped, sure, but the suffering is about to get worse than anyone could possibly have imagined. So what was this radical experiment? It was all built on this one single chilling concept, year zero. The idea that you could literally wipe history clean and force society to start over from scratch. This is so key to understanding everything that happened next. This wasn't about reform. It was about total obliteration. Everything that made Cambodia, its culture, its families, its knowledge, all of that was now considered an enemy of the revolution. And they put this vision into action with terrifying speed. Immediately, cities were emptied at gunpoint. Money became worthless paper. Religion was outlawed, and families were just torn apart. And anyone with an education, doctors, teachers, lawyers, they were now considered enemies of the state, and they were systematically targeted to be eliminated. The stated goal behind all this madness was, on the surface, a utopian one, a pure, peasant-led society, totally independent from the outside world, where everyone was equal because everyone had absolutely nothing. But that ideal, it would come at an unimaginable human cost. Because the reality of year zero wasn't a utopia. It was a nationwide slave labor camp. It was a place of starvation, sickness, and mass murder. For the average person, life just became this endless cycle of grueling work in the fields, often for 12 hours a day or even more, all on starvation rations. With hospitals emptied out and doctors killed, disease just ran wild. And the slightest complaint or even just the perception of disloyalty could get you sent to a detention center for torture and then execution. The result was a human catastrophe. In less than 4 years, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people died. I mean, just let that sink in. Nearly 1 out of every 4 men, women, and children in the entire country gone, wiped out by execution, starvation, or disease. It's a scale of death that's just almost impossible to wrap your head around. Well, a regime this brutal and this self-destructive, it just couldn't last. Its paranoia eventually turned outward, and that led to its own downfall, leaving behind a legacy of absolute ruin. It all started to unravel when growing border conflicts with Vietnam gave their neighbor the perfect reason to invade in late 1978, and the Khmer Rouge government, it collapsed almost instantly. Pol Pot himself escaped into the jungle, where he led a guerrilla war for years, but he never got power back. He actually died under house arrest, betrayed by his own followers. The physical damage was absolute. The country's infrastructure was gone. The entire educated class had been annihilated. But the deepest wounds, they weren't physical. The regime left behind this legacy of profound multi-generational trauma. I mean, how do you rebuild a society when the very idea of trust in your neighbors, in leaders, even in your family has been systematically destroyed? That psychological scar would haunt Cambodia for decades. For a nation still trying to grapple with its own past, the long road to justice began. International tribunals were eventually set up to prosecute the surviving Khmer Rouge leaders, a slow, painful, and pretty imperfect process of accountability for these unimaginable crimes. The story of Pol Pot and Year Zero is really a horrifying, permanent answer to that question. It's a warning that when any ideology demands total control, when it tries to erase history, culture, and individuality, the price is never utopia. It's always a descent into the absolute darkest parts of humanity.